It's strange how an ordinary morning can become the one that divides your life into before and after. The kettle was whistling, sunlight was slipping through the curtains, and for a moment everything looked the same, until he turned to me with a calmness that didn't belong in that kitchen and said, "I don't love you anymore." I didn't understand the words at first. They just hung in the air, fragile and unreal, like soap bubbles waiting to burst. But when he picked up his suitcase, the same one we took on our honeymoon, and placed his wedding ring on the table without a tremor in his hand, I knew this was not confusion. It was finality. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry, didn't even cry. He just stood there, detached, like a stranger who had come to collect the last of his belongings. I watched him walk toward the door, my heart trying to form words my mouth couldn't find. I wanted to remind him of the nights we planned our future, the house we dreamed of building, the life we had barely begun to live. But all that came out was a faint whisper, "Please don't do this." When the door clicked shut, the sound was small, but it hollowed out everything inside me. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was sharp and endless, the kind of silence that screams. The house that had once been filled with the rhythm of laughter and footsteps now echoed with a stillness that felt almost cruel. I sat on the cold floor for hours, maybe days. I lost count. The world outside kept moving, but time inside that house froze. Every object around me became an artifact of a life I no longer had. His coffee mug, still on the counter. His jacket by the door. The dent on his pillow that refused to rise. I felt like a ghost haunting my own home, watching my past life play on a loop that I couldn't turn off. Grief does not announce itself loudly. It seeps in quietly, wrapping itself around you until breathing feels like work. I stopped answering calls. I stopped eating. I stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror who looked both broken and invisible. Each day blurred into the next, and I wondered if this was what dying without dying felt like. Existing, but erased. Then one night, while searching the cupboards for something, maybe painkillers, maybe answers, I found a small dusty box at the back of a drawer. Inside were old soap molds, half-used fragrance oils, and a few notes from a hobby I once thought I'd pursue. I remembered how years ago I had tried making soap just for fun, how proud I had felt of the simplest creation, and how he had laughed, calling it my little experiment. For a long time, I stared at that mold in my hand, wondering if touching it again would hurt or heal. I didn't know why, but I began cleaning the counter, setting up the stove, and heating a small block of glycerin. My hands trembled as I stirred in the fragrance. Lavender, the scent of calm. Hadn't felt in months. The process was messy, clumsy, unplanned. But when I poured it into the mold and watched it set, something within me shifted. It was just soap. Imperfect, uneven, cracked at the edges, yet it was proof that I could still make something. And maybe, just maybe, that meant I could remake myself, too. As I held that rough little bar under the dim kitchen light, the house didn't feel as empty anymore. There was a faint pulse again, a quiet rhythm that belonged to me. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the ruins of everything he left behind, a voice whispered, "This isn't where you end. This is where you begin." Grief is strange. It doesn't always come with loud sobs or broken glass. Sometimes it shows up quietly in your hands when you're melting soap at 3 a.m. because you're too numb to sleep and too empty to cry anymore. That night, I wasn't chasing healing or building a business. I was just trying to make something that didn't fall apart, because everything else in my life already had. And as the glycerin started to bubble in the old saucepan, I realized I was stirring not just ingredients, but all the heartbreak I couldn't say out loud. The first bar I made looked like a mistake. It was uneven, a little squishy, and smelled faintly of lavender. The scent he once said reminded him of me. But unlike me, this thing I had made didn't crack under pressure. I didn't care that it was ugly. I had made it. And in a house where nothing felt like mine anymore, that tiny bar was something I created with my own hands. Even though I knew it wasn't perfect, not even close. I took a photo under the dull yellow kitchen light and posted it on Instagram without thinking much. "Trying something new tonight," I wrote. No hashtags, no captions about healing or self-discovery. I wasn't looking for sympathy or likes. I just wanted to share one small thing that didn't hurt. To my surprise, a friend from college messaged within minutes. "This looks amazing," she said. "Can I buy one?" It wasn't the sale that made me cry. It was the fact that someone, somewhere, saw value in something I did, even when I barely saw value in myself. That $5 payment lit something inside me, something I thought had been extinguished the day he walked out the door. I sold an old handbag and 2 coats I didn't need, bought better soap molds, searched online forums, watched hours of YouTube tutorials on how to blend oils, how to create swirls, how to package with care. My kitchen became my lab, no longer a place where I mourned what I had lost, but where I slowly began to rebuild what I might become. Every batch I made carried a memory. Lemongrass for the sharpness of waking up alone. Vanilla for the warmth I used to find in our quiet Sunday mornings. Rose for softness. The kind I once apologized for, but now poured unapologetically into every mold. These weren't just bars of soap. They were fragments of me, melted down and reformed. With time, I began to sell them to friends of friends. Each message, each "this smells incredible," gave me another reason to keep going. The little brown paper packages I wrapped at night became more than products. They became symbols of survival. I was creating beauty out of something broken. After a few weeks of filling orders from Instagram DMs and shipping through the local post office, I did something that terrified me. I signed up for my first craft fair. It felt like the next right step, the next level of courage. I told myself people would understand, would feel the story in my work, would connect to the effort in every bar I placed on the table. But when the day came, and I stood behind my tiny stall with soaps I had poured my heart into, the crowd didn't stop. They didn't smile. They didn't care. And for the first time since I began this fragile journey, doubt returned, curling itself around my spine like smoke, whispering, "What if you're still not enough?" There's a very specific kind of heartbreak that doesn't happen behind closed doors. It happens under bright lights, in public, when you're standing behind a booth you built with your own hands, and the world walks by as if you don't exist. I had poured everything into those soaps, not just ingredients and scents, but months of survival, loneliness, and all the courage it took to show up after being left behind, like yesterday's trash. As I arranged them carefully on the craft fair table, I wasn't just selling soap. I was quietly asking the world, "Do I matter again yet?" And as the crowd moved past without pausing, I started to realize just how much silence can scream. I had spent weeks preparing for this one day, redesigning labels, researching pricing, crafting new scent combinations, and investing the last of my savings in packaging that I hoped would make someone stop and say, "Tell me more." But the people who walked past didn't look at me like a brave entrepreneur starting over from nothing. They saw a woman selling handmade soap and assumed I was playing pretend. I smiled politely, stood tall, and said hello to hundreds of strangers who didn't even hear me. When someone finally picked up a bar, my heart fluttered with hope. But she looked at it, wrinkled her nose, and said to her friend with a smirk, "Smells like someone's kitchen experiment." I laughed awkwardly, pretending not to care, but the words landed exactly where they were meant to, deep inside my ribs, where the last pieces of my confidence were already fragile and bruised. Another woman, sharp dress, high heels, clearly someone who knew the price of everything, picked up a bar of lavender soap and inspected it like it had failed her expectations without even trying. She asked the price, and when I told her, she laughed. Actually laughed, before saying, "It's cute, but it's too homemade to cost that much." She set it down like it was unworthy, and walked away, without looking back. At that moment, I didn't feel like a woman rebuilding her life. I felt like a fraud, wearing hope like a cheap perfume, praying someone wouldn't smell the desperation underneath. My throat burned, not from embarrassment, but from the effort it took to keep the tears locked behind my eyes. I packed up that night with shaking hands, barely able to look anyone in the eye, because failure feels heavier when it's witnessed. I kept replaying every glance, every shrug, every dismissive comment. And the worst part was, I started to agree with them. Maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe I never had been. But then, 2 days later, while folding laundry in silence, my phone buzzed with a message that I almost didn't open. It was from a woman I hadn't spoken to before. She said she had bought my rose and oat bar at the market. Her words were soft, but struck like thunder. "Your soap helped my daughter's skin. She's been itching for weeks, and nothing worked. Yours did. Thank you." I read that message again and again, not because I didn't believe it, but because I finally did. Someone had been touched by something I made, not out of pity, not as a favor, but because it worked. And as I stood there in my living room, still holding a half-folded towel and crying into my sleeve, I heard another ping on my phone, and then another. And another, what I didn't know yet, was that somewhere out there, someone with a very large following had just posted about my soaps, and within hours, I wouldn't be questioning if I was enough anymore. I'd be drowning in proof I was, and nowhere near ready for what was coming next. I used to think fear was what I felt the day my husband walked away, but real fear arrived later, disguised as a dream come true. When I opened my phone and saw hundreds of notifications, my breath caught, not from joy, but from the overwhelming realization that my little handmade brand, born in silence and heartbreak, had just exploded into something far too big for the four walls of my kitchen to contain. It was everything I had hoped for, but in that moment, it didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like a breakdown waiting to happen. It started with a single Instagram story posted by a well-known skincare influencer, someone I hadn't reached out to, someone who had somehow discovered my product and called it a hidden gem. By morning, I had 700 confirmed orders and over 1,000 messages sitting in my inbox. My website froze from the traffic. My payment processor flagged the surge as suspicious. And as I stared at the screen, my stomach twisted with dread, because I knew the truth no one else did. I had less than 200 bars in stock, and no plan for what came next. The excitement lasted only minutes. Then came the cold flush of terror, the tightening in my chest, the racing, thoughts I couldn't slow down. How would I fulfill all these orders? Where would I find the money to buy more supplies? What if I ruined everything before it even started? The apartment felt smaller with every question, the walls closing in as I realized that success, when it comes too fast, can feel a lot like drowning. I cried, not softly or politely, but the way people cry when everything they've built might collapse under the weight of their own wishes coming true. But then, as I curled up on the kitchen floor, the same floor I had sobbed on when my marriage ended, I remembered something. I had survived worse. I had started this with nothing but pain and soap molds. I had figured it out before. I could do it again. So I wiped my face, called my cousin, and asked if she could take a week off to help me. I sold an old ring I never wore, cashed out the last of my savings, and ordered bulk ingredients, new molds, and extra packaging. The kitchen became a battlefield. My cousin and I worked in shifts, measuring oils, pouring molds, stamping labels until our fingers ached. We barely slept. We skipped meals. But somehow, with every bar we wrapped, we stitched together a little more belief in ourselves. There were mistakes, of course. Some batches came out wrong. A few orders were delayed. But most people, bless them, were kind, patient, understanding. Some even wrote messages like, "Take your time. I just want to support you." That kindness became fuel. I kept going, even when I was too tired to think, because now it wasn't just about me. It was about all the people who believed I was worth waiting for. Then, just as the panic began to settle and my rhythm returned, I received a message that didn't come from a customer. It came from a stranger with a business logo for a profile picture. "Hi," it read. "I run a small cosmetics factory just outside the city. I saw what you're doing. If you're ready to scale, I can help." I read it twice. My hands paused over the mixer. A factory? Me? Was this finally the answer I'd been working toward? Or just another impossible choice in a journey already bursting at the seams? I thought strength meant doing it all on my own, until the night I collapsed mid-shift, my arms trembling from pouring one too many batches, and found my mother quietly watching me from the kitchen doorway. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer pity, didn't tell me I was doing too much. Instead, she stepped forward, wiped her hands on her apron like she was clocking in for a job she never applied for, and softly said, "Show me what to do. I'll help you now." And just like that, the woman who had held me in her arms as a child was now holding up the business that had become my second chance at life. It was strange at first, letting her into a world I had built from the wreckage of my heartbreak, letting her touch the thing that had pulled me back from the edge. But as she stood beside me, rolling molds, stirring oils, sealing boxes, I realized she wasn't just helping me fulfill orders. She was helping me carry the weight of everything I hadn't said out loud. Grief, regret, fear, ambition. It all lived in that kitchen now, and she handled it with more grace than I ever could have imagined. We found a rhythm without speaking. She knew when to pass me the labels before I asked. She instinctively doubled my measurements when orders started rising. When I wanted to break down after a bad review, she poured me tea and reminded me I didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. There were moments, quiet and fleeting, when she'd glance at me with something like pride, and I held on to those glances like gold because they reminded me I wasn't just making soap. I was making something my mother believed in. The business transformed overnight. Customers noticed. Our packaging felt more polished, our process more efficient, our energy more aligned. But beyond that, there was warmth in everything we sent out, a kind of invisible signature that said, "This was made by two women who've known pain and kept going anyway." Reviews poured in from strangers saying our products felt like comfort, like care, like coming home, and every word felt like a thread in a story we were now writing together. One night, after finishing a massive batch of rose clay bars, we sat in the kitchen surrounded by trays and packaging scraps, both of us covered in oil and laughter. She looked at me and said almost casually, "You know this isn't just about soap anymore. You're rebuilding your life, and you're doing it one bar at a time." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because we both knew she was right. That week we hit our biggest milestone yet. Over 1,000 units sold. We toasted with tea instead of champagne, exhausted, but quietly proud. For the first time, I began to believe we might be okay, not just in business, but in the fragile, invisible ways that mattered more. But just as we began to feel steady, as though all the chaos was finally giving way to something solid, a storm rolled in that we never saw coming. Our biggest client placed a bulk order, over 300 units. We packed every single bar with care, triple-checked every label, sealed the boxes with pride. And then, 3 days later, they came back. Unopened, rejected, melted into one sticky, unsellable mess. The summer heat had turned our work into sludge. I stood frozen at the door, staring at the ruined shipment, heart sinking into the floor. And beside me, my mother just whispered, "We'll figure it out." But I didn't believe her. Not this time. Not yet. There's a strange kind of heartbreak that comes when you've done everything right, followed every rule, and poured every drop of yourself into a dream, only to watch it unravel in silence. When the boutique confirmed their order for 3,000 bars, it didn't feel like just another transaction. It felt like a doorway, like everything I'd worked for had finally led to this one moment that would prove I wasn't just making soap. I was building something real. For weeks, my mother and I worked like machines, fueled by exhaustion and hope, never cutting corners, never missing a step. But as we sealed the final box and waved goodbye to the courier, we didn't know that the summer heat outside was about to turn all that effort into a fragrant, melted disaster. I remember the email that came just 4 days later, short, cold, and surgical. The boutique was canceling not just the order, but our entire contract, citing unsatisfactory product condition. They had attached photos, boxes soaked through, bars melted into sticky puddles, colors bleeding, labels warped beyond recognition. It looked like someone had poured our work into a pot and boiled it alive. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat staring at the screen, my chest tight, throat dry, while my mother read the email over my shoulder in silence. We had no savings left after buying ingredients in bulk. No backup plan. That order was supposed to carry us through the next 3 months. Instead, all we had was a ruined reputation and a return shipment we didn't even know how to pay for. For the first time since I'd made that first ugly little soap bar in my kitchen, I felt the old doubt creeping back in. The voice that said, "You were never meant to make it this far." But before I could sink too far into that voice, my mother, steady as ever, placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered the one sentence that changed everything. "You didn't come this far just to melt like that soap." It wasn't just a clever line. It was a reminder of who I'd become, of how many times I'd gotten back up. So I did what I always did. I got to work. This time not with oils or scents, but with spreadsheets, research papers, shipping data, and packaging materials. I learned about thermal insulation, dry ice, liner boxes, and carrier regulations. I stayed up reading case studies from other small businesses who had failed, and rebuilt smarter. And instead of hiding the disaster, I did something that scared me even more. I shared it publicly. I posted the photos, explained what went wrong, admitted my mistakes, and told my customers what I was doing to fix them. I expected backlash. I expected refunds and unsubscribes. But what I got instead was grace. Hundreds of comments, DMs, and emails flooded in. People thanking me for being honest, for not pretending perfection, for showing the mess. Some customers reordered immediately. Others sent words of encouragement. And for the first time, I realized that trust wasn't built by always succeeding. It was built by how you survive failure. Just when the dust had begun to settle, and I was starting to believe we could rebuild from the ashes, a new email arrived, this time, with a subject line that didn't feel like rejection, but like a question. Factory tour invitation. Let's discuss scaling. It was from a regional cosmetics manufacturer who had been following my journey silently. They had seen my honesty, my growth, and they believed I was ready for something bigger, and I wanted to believe that too. But I wasn't sure if I could walk into a factory, after spending so long surviving in my kitchen, without feeling like an imposter all over again. I expected cold steel, the hiss of machines, and maybe the feeling that I didn't belong there. What I didn't expect, as I stepped into the factory's reception with my worn notebook and trembling hands, was how deeply I would feel like I had walked into a version of my own future that had been waiting for me all along. The air smelled of essential oils and fresh packaging, not chaos or stress like my kitchen, but purpose, rhythm, and the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from systems built to last. I was there for a casual tour, just to see how things worked, but within 5 minutes I stopped looking at it as a visit and started seeing it as a blueprint. Every machine that filled those rooms, Every conveyor belt that moved finished bars into boxes, every labeled shelf with formulas and samples. They weren't intimidating anymore. They were beautiful. They were proof that what I was doing in my tiny, cluttered apartment could live beyond the limits of my hands. For the first time, I didn't feel small in the face of growth. I felt called toward it. The woman who ran the facility walked me through each section like a mentor, not a manager. And every time I asked a question, she answered like someone who had once been in my shoes. I couldn't sleep that night. My brain spun faster than it had in months, not with panic this time, but with plans. What would it look like to scale without losing my soul? How could I preserve the heart of what I'd built while reaching more people? Could my story live inside every bar, even if I wasn't hand-pouring each one anymore? 2 days later, I stood before a panel of local businesswomen, part of a regional entrepreneur grant program, knees shaking, voice cracking, holding up a soap bar with trembling fingers as I told them about the night my husband left, about how the first thing I rebuilt was a lavender bar in a scratched-up mold, and how now that bar had helped hundreds of people feel seen, soothed, and clean again, not just on their skin, but in their spirit. I didn't win the biggest prize, but I won something. A smaller grant with just enough funding to push me one step closer to expansion. Enough to move from dreaming to doing. Enough to start laying bricks for something I could pass on, not just protect. And that changed everything. I stopped thinking in batches. I started thinking in systems, in strategies. I reimagined my packaging, hired a part-time designer to help me with branding. I studied customer behavior. I rewrote my mission statement. I started turning my Instagram from a journal into a journey that people could follow and invest in. One afternoon, while sitting at the same kitchen table that once held nothing but broken pieces of my past, I laid out a map of my city and drew a tiny red circle around an empty industrial lot I had passed for years. A space I never imagined I'd have the courage to step inside. 3 days later, an email landed in my inbox. Its subject line simple, almost clinical. Your warehouse lease has been approved. Please confirm your move-in date. I stared at it, my cursor hovering over the reply button, unable to click. This was it. The first step into becoming something bigger than I had ever imagined. And all I could think was, what if I wasn't ready? What if I failed on a scale that couldn't be cleaned up with lavender and grace? Because dreaming is one thing, but building that dream into something you can't undo, that takes a kind of courage I wasn't sure I still had. The day I signed the lease, I didn't cry, not because it wasn't emotional, but because I had already shed every tear I had the night he walked out, leaving me in the ruins of a home that never truly felt like mine. Now, 2 years later, I stood in a dusty, echoing industrial unit with concrete floors, peeling walls, and a faint oil smell in the air. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something solid beneath my feet that didn't come with conditions. There were no photos on the walls, no furniture to anchor me, and no man standing beside me pretending he saw my worth. Just keys in my hand, dreams in my chest, and space wide enough to contain both. The factory was nothing special on paper. Small, slightly run down, with a flickering fluorescent light above the entrance and a rickety side office I planned to turn into my command center. But to me, it was perfect. It was mine. No more shoving supplies under my kitchen sink. No more competing with the fridge for counter space. No more measuring fragrance blends next to last night's dishes. Here, I could build something clean, something big, something free of the ghosts that once haunted every corner of my apartment. I named it Phoenix, not because it sounded poetic, but because it felt necessary. A constant reminder that everything I thought had destroyed me had, in fact, been setting me on fire just so I could rise again. I couldn't do it alone anymore, and I didn't want to. So I hired 3 women, all single moms, all fighters in their own way, and trained them not just in process and product, but in belief. I told them this was more than a job. It was proof that no one's story had to end in heartbreak or survival. Within weeks, the energy in that space shifted. Laughter bounced off the walls, labels were stamped with care, and each package was filled not just with soap, but with stories of second chances. Orders grew. My branding sharpened. We moved from local boutiques to regional suppliers. I streamlined inventory, built bulk partnerships, and watched my dream expand with a kind of graceful ferocity that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. One quiet Friday, after our biggest shipping day yet, I sat at my small desk in the corner of the factory and pulled out a sleek little sample box I had designed for high-end clients. Inside was my newest bar, bergamot and cedar, clean and strong, with a handwritten note that simply said, "Hope this finds you well." I mailed it to my ex. No return address, no bitterness. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. That silence was all the closure I needed. Because in that moment, I finally understood that real healing isn't loud. It's not made of revenge or validation. It's made of doing well without needing to be seen doing it. Everything felt stable, maybe even easy, and that's when I should have known something was coming. Because growth has a funny way of testing you, right when you start to feel safe. One Monday morning, I walked into the factory to find my team waiting with anxious faces and half-finished checklists. A major raw material shipment, the one we needed for nearly every product in our line, hadn't arrived. No tracking update, no delivery notice, no call, just nothing. I called the supplier, straight to voicemail. My inbox was empty. My next orders were due in 3 days, and for the first time in months, my certainty cracked. Because without that shipment, there was no soap. And without soap, there was no Phoenix. The phone rang in the middle of a packaging run, and I almost didn't answer. My hands were covered in oils, and we were already behind schedule because of the missing shipment scare just days before. But something told me to pick up. On the other end was a woman with a calm voice and a sharp pitch. She said she worked with a national retail chain, had seen my products online, and wanted to discuss placing our soaps in 18 of their regional stores. For a full minute, I didn't speak. I just stood there staring at the wall, heart pounding, convinced it was some kind of cruel scam. Because things like this didn't happen to people like me. Not women who started in kitchens and cried over melted orders and empty supply trucks. But it wasn't a scam. It was real. The chain was expanding its clean beauty section and wanted fresh, story-driven, female-owned brands, and somehow I had made the shortlist. I dropped everything and scheduled a video call that same evening. My voice shook the whole time. I didn't have a legal team or a business degree. I had spreadsheets made in Google Docs, margins I calculated with a calculator app, and a heart full of grit. So I negotiated not with polish, but with purpose, explaining why my pricing mattered, how we made every bar by hand, how my story wasn't just a brand narrative. It was the reason people kept coming back. They agreed. We signed a limited trial contract. I was in. From that moment, everything accelerated. We moved from producing hundreds of bars per week to thousands per month. I hired 2 more team members, brought in a fulfillment consultant, upgraded our packaging machines, and had our story professionally printed onto every box. Made by women who've known failure and chose to build again. Seeing our products lined on store shelves next to million-dollar brands, it felt like magic. People tagged us in photos. Reviewers called our soap soulful. One woman messaged to say she cried reading the label before even using it. But alongside the growth came pressure. Intense, unrelenting, invisible pressure that sat on my shoulders while I tried to smile through meetings and manage staff morale. Retail wasn't forgiving. Every delivery had to be flawless. Every barcode had to scan. Every complaint came straight back to me. I was still answering emails at midnight, still checking tracking numbers at dawn, and still trying to make sure that nothing we shipped ever lost that heart we started with. Then, one night, just as I was shutting down my laptop and finally letting myself enjoy the quiet hum of success, an email arrived that sent my stomach into freefall. The subject line was blunt and in all caps: "Urgent, quality issue detected. Store Duggar 7." I clicked, hands trembling. The message detailed a customer complaint. Multiple units had reportedly developed discoloration on shelves. Photos were attached. My soap, warped, with strange air pockets and blurred labels. I stared at the images, disbelief morphing into dread. I rushed to check our batch logs. Everything had passed internal QA. Nothing looked wrong in production. But the truth was, something was wrong. And I didn't know if it was packaging, formula, handling, or heat exposure again. I had just stepped into the big leagues. And now, one crack in the foundation could bring the whole thing crashing down. And this time, the stakes weren't just about me. They were about my team, my brand, and the belief others had placed in me. If I didn't fix this fast, I wasn't just risking products. I was risking everything I'd built since the day he left. When the invitation to the awards gala arrived, I stared at it for so long that the screen dimmed and locked itself, as if even my phone knew I didn't believe I belonged in a room like that. I had no dress, no heels, and no idea how to walk into a ballroom filled with women who looked like they belonged on magazine covers, while I still smelled like rosemary oil half the time and wore shipping tape on my fingers like rings. I was ready to decline quietly, to pretend I hadn't seen the email, until my team walked in with a box wrapped in brown craft paper and tied with gold string, and inside was a floor-length satin dress, the exact shade of my brand's signature gold. "You need to go," one of them said softly but firmly. "We need them to see the woman we see every day." So I went, not with confidence, but with gratitude stitched into every step. The night was overwhelming. Bright lights, polished speeches, the sound of champagne glasses clinking, and conversations happening in circles I never imagined myself standing inside. I felt like I was watching someone else's life from behind glass, until they called my name. Woman of the Year in Business, for impact, resilience, and redefining beauty through survival. When I stood on that stage, the applause felt like thunder and silence all at once. I took the mic, hands shaking, and looked at the crowd, all dressed in elegance, all holding their own stories behind their smiles. And then I said something I hadn't rehearsed. I told them about the kitchen floor I once cried on, about the first soap I ruined, about the 3,000 bars that melted in the mail, and about the woman I used to be who truly believed her worth had left the day her husband did. I didn't weep for the award. I wept for her, because she never imagined she'd ever feel worthy of being seen again. After the speech, people hugged me. Strangers said they'd followed my journey. A young woman in a blue dress waited until the crowd had cleared, then came up to me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I saw your video last year, the one about failing forward. That made me believe I could start over." And that was the moment I realized something that no title, trophy, or retail deal could ever replace. The real win wasn't success, it was impact. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a mirror someone else had used to find their reflection. Back at the factory, my team had hung up a giant "Congratulations" banner across the packaging station. We celebrated with chai and leftover cake from the corner store, the kind of party that didn't need champagne to feel rich. I let myself enjoy it. Let myself believe, for once, that the worst was behind us. But the thing about building something from scratch is that you're never done protecting it. Just as I was packing up my trophy to take home, a notification buzzed on my phone, an official letter from the local industry authority. Notice: your manufacturing site has been selected for a surprise inspection, expected within 5 business days. Please ensure all compliance and documentation is updated. My throat tightened. I looked around at the busy factory, shipments half assembled, Ingredients in the open, papers in drawers we hadn't touched in weeks. This time, it wasn't a marketing challenge or a product recall. This was a test of everything behind the curtain, and one mistake wouldn't just hurt our image. It could shut us down. There's a special kind of fear that doesn't scream or shake your bones. It just sits on your chest and refuses to move. That entire week leading up to the audit, I couldn't sleep. I kept playing mental horror reels of clipboard-carrying officials frowning at paperwork I forgot to file, inspectors pointing out something small but crucial, and my team watching helplessly as everything we built slipped through our fingers because I missed one regulation in a sea of them. It didn't feel like a business check. It felt like a final exam I hadn't studied for, even though I'd been showing up for class every single day. The moment I told my team, no one panicked, at least not outwardly. Instead, everyone moved like clockwork. We pulled out old batch records, reformatted safety sheets, labeled everything twice, checked expiry dates on every raw ingredient, and printed fresh copies of all compliance documents. We repainted the safety stripes on the floor, sealed every open bin, and sanitized every corner twice over. The factory didn't look like a place where 3 women had been building their future with blood and hope. It looked like a lab, a dream with polished edges, a battle station. I tried to stay calm, but every time I walked past the soap lab, my throat tightened. That space, once the heart of our creativity, now felt like the weakest link. We'd changed a few processes recently, streamlined things, moved some tools around, and suddenly I couldn't remember whether we had documented everything the way the law required. I didn't tell my team that. I just kept working, kept fixing, kept rehearsing the answers to questions I wasn't even sure would be asked. When the auditors arrived, I felt like a soldier standing in front of her own battlefield, praying she hadn't missed the one landmine that could undo her. 3 of them walked in, all polite, all professional, and began the tour with clipboards in hand and clinical expressions that never cracked. They asked about workflow, storage conditions, staff hygiene logs, emergency protocols, and cross-contamination control. I answered every question like I had been programmed to. I smiled. I nodded. I handed over binders with trembling fingers I kept hidden behind my back. We moved through the building slowly, from the production floor to packaging area to storage shelves. Every corner they passed without comment felt like a small victory. I started to believe we might actually make it through untouched. Then, just as we stepped into the soap lab, our sacred, messy, heart-driven soap lab, one of the inspectors stopped walking. He looked down at the edge of the counter, narrowed his eyes, and leaned in. I followed his gaze and saw what he saw. A tiny crack in the surface. One we had missed. One that could, in theory, harbor contamination. He didn't say a word right away. Just pulled out a form from his folder, clicked his pen, and looked at me. I felt every heartbeat in my body collapse into a single silent scream. He glanced at the crack again, then at the clipboard, and made a mark, slow, deliberate, like a judge signing a verdict. My entire team was silent behind me, waiting. I tried not to panic, tried not to imagine the entire factory being shut down over a countertop. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a second form, one with a red header. He said, "There's a procedural issue in your soap lab that needs to be addressed." And at that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. And the next few hours could change everything. Exactly 7 days after the inspection, 7 sleepless, breath-holding days, the final audit report arrived, and I sat there staring at the subject line, afraid to open it. I had never realized just how much weight a single email could carry until that moment. My heart pounded, like it did the night he left, like it did the morning we lost our biggest client, like it did every time I thought I had failed, but chose to show up anyway. And when I finally clicked it open and read the first line, "Your site is approved for national production and expansion," I let out a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. It wasn't a scream. It was released. Relief. Joy. And maybe even forgiveness. The rest of that day felt like sunlight after a storm. I surprised my mother with a ticket to Paris, a dream she had spoken of quietly for decades, always in the maybe one day tone people use when they've already accepted it won't happen. She cried when she saw the envelope. "I didn't think I'd ever leave this country," she whispered. "But you've carried me farther than I ever thought I'd go." I didn't say anything. I just held her hand and thanked her for holding me up when I couldn't carry myself. I hired 5 more women, each with a story that echoed something I had once felt. Women who had been left, lost, overlooked, or underestimated. And I watched them bloom under structure, purpose, and shared ambition. I wasn't just building a factory anymore. I was building a foundation, a legacy, something bigger than soap and packaging and retail contracts, something that reminded people what was possible after pain. And then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, with orders shipping smoothly and laughter echoing in the warehouse, I got the message. It was from him, the man who had once left me on the kitchen floor in a home that felt like a cage, the man who said I wasn't ambitious enough, that I wasn't enough, period. His words were brief. "I'm proud of you. Truly." I stared at them for a long time, not because they moved me, but because they didn't, not because I wanted his approval, but because I no longer needed it. I typed back, "Thank you, but I never needed your pride." And I meant every word, because by then I had built something from the ashes he left me in. I had taken silence and turned it into scent. I had turned the weight of abandonment into the warmth of creation. I had made light from heartbreak, and not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been told she couldn't start again. I shut the laptop, stood up, and watched my team work. A room full of women laughing, lifting, creating. A room I had once only imagined, a version of my life I had once been too broken to believe in. And then, just as I turned off the lights and headed for the door, another notification buzzed. An email, subject line. "Can you mentor 1,000 women this year?" I read it once, then again. My hands didn't shake, because this time I wasn't walking into something uncertain. I was walking into something bigger, and I knew, deep in my bones, my story hadn't ended. It had only just begun. If this story touched something deep inside you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show support, subscribe if you believe in second chances, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to rebuild. I read every comment, so tell me, what are you rising from?